Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to today's webinar. We'll be talking about REST testing made easy with SoapUI Pro and the Ready API platform. Let's go through some quick, all right. Today's presenters. My name is Dan Giordano. I'm the product marketing manager for the API side of the house at SmartBear, specializing in Ready API. And with us today, we also have Michael Hawley, who's a solutions engineer for the Ready API suite as well. We will be recording today's session. If you have any questions, please ask them in the Q&A box. I will be combing through them as the session goes on. And then at the end of today's session, we'll go through some answers. So feel free to drop any of the questions you have right in there. And then we have a short exit survey at the end of today's class as well. All right, so who's SmartBear? Let's start with an intro there. We're a Boston-based company with 7 offices globally that focus on creating solutions for developer, testing, and operations teams to help them instill quality throughout the entire software delivery lifecycle. We were founded in 2009, and we continue to add products and innovation to our portfolio, including the popular open source tools, SoapUI, and Swagger, and the Open API spec, and our newest additions to the family as well this year with 2018 with Hip Test, and then just recently Zephyr. So 2 huge test management platforms that we've just added to the family. And this is kind of a look at the entire portfolio. We have a range of solutions on the UI side and the API side, fulfilling answers for developers, testers, and operations teams. Today, we'll be focusing mainly on the API side, so the bottom of this portion of the map. So maybe a little Swagger Hub with Swagger spec, SoapUI Pro, our API functional testing tool, ServiceUI Pro, our API virtualization tool, and then LoadUI Pro, our performance and load testing API tool. So that's where we'll be focused mainly today. Just a quick interruption is our little ad for SmartBear Connect. So SmartBear Connect is running in almost 3 weeks, October 29th, October 30th, at the Boston Marriott Copley Place. So if you'd like to join us, you can check out more information at smartbear.com/connect-2018. This is an awesome experience last year. We had guest speakers, we had customers sharing their years of testing knowledge and experience. And this year, again, it's right downtown Boston. All right, so our agenda today, we have our API basics, our REST basics, our API testing, our end-to-end API testing, and then we'll show a little bit about shifting left with automation. All right, so what is an API? An API is application programming interface. It's the intermediary piece of software that allows one piece of an application to make use of data or functionality of another one. So it's kind of the way that 2 machines are talking to each other. It's been standardized lately by SOAP, REST, protocol HTTP, JMS. These are some standard kind of protocols and architectures of the web services, but an API is all about that intermediary piece of software that combines a database and then either a UI or just, again, the interface itself, the API layer. REST versus SOAP is kind of a classic here, and it's something that we're we definitely know and we're familiar with, being called SoapUI and working well with REST. And it's not really the right conversation, but it's something we get bogged in all the time. The difference between the 2 is really the way they're expressed. One, SOAP, it's a protocol, right? It communicates via XML, and it has a tight coupling between the client and the server implementation. So think of it more like a desktop application. On the REST side, we have a architectural style. So it's stateless. It communicates a couple of different ways, JSON, RDF, XML, and we have defined resources that we'll get to in a little bit. But think of it obviously more like a website or a browser. where there's protocol and standardized methods to work with, but REST is really just the architectural pattern. When we're talking about security as well, REST works over HTTP. That's the protocol it uses. So all security measures that that protocol has, it inherits. That's transport level security. So while it's in the wire, it's as secure as the protocol it's going across. But once it's on the other side of the world, kind of where it's going, we lose any security features over that. It can be manipulated post actually getting there. Now, a SOAP API is a little bit more secure in that it supports WS security, and we can actually create some type of encryption on the other side and know that our payload needs to match an expected output. Talking RESTfully, these are our REST API actions. Most of this webinar today will be about REST, obviously. So here's our 4 most common verbs that we're using. Get, we're retrieving or reading data. We have post, adding new data to a database or table. Put, updating that data. So a post might be adding my name to a database. A put might be adding a picture of myself after my name had already been added in that database. And it's not a, we're not removing it, we're updating it, and that's tracked. And then the last one is delete. So delete is actually removing that data from the table. So just a really quick comparison that sometimes we work with here is here's a picture right here of what a website does when we look for something like Boston coordinates. So the city of Boston coordinates, it outputs it here in this human readable format. And the URL structure is pretty clean here. We can follow along pretty closely. And then on the other side, what an API does is returns that same information, but in kind of a more machine readable way. So here, that visualization we saw before, that website, things might move around. But in our API payload that's showing, we have our location and the latitude and longitude. That's not going to move. We know exactly where it's nested, and it's part of that contract we make with the API. But I think it's a pretty powerful kind of analogy between the two, because they really are similar, that RESTful API and how they interact with the web. So our first example we'll talk about today, actually besides that Google Maps, is the pet store example, which is a classic example that was made famous by Swagger tooling. But here we have some operations, a post, a put, and a get. And that post here in the first one, we're going to post a new pet. Pet is going to be our method there. Modifying a pet next. We're actually going to, again, maybe upload an image to that pet after it's already added to the database. And then the last one is read a pet. This is something that we'll maybe touch upon today with the virtualization aspect of our tool. But here we're going to get something by availability, maybe by pet ID, and we're going to actually extract that data from the database. A closer look at kind of some REST testing basics and what we'll be looking and what it looks like, I guess, from an actual visual standpoint. In the browser here, we have our actual method and then our endpoint, our request headers, content length, host, all these things can kind of trim down and really specify the information we're asking for. You'll see that in the response as well with our access controls. So our response code on the right, again, similar to the website, we're going to get a 200, a 400, or 404. All these things are normal procedures of the web HTTP protocol. Content type, this is whether we're going to be looking at JSON or XML. And again, this is a point of specificity when we're requesting that data that we can have. Our actual response body, this is the end game that we're looking for. And this is what we'll be creating many of our assertions against in the SoapUI Pro tool. So here we have an ID 1045, and a category under that is dogs. Here's a long list of some other examples of everything we just looked at. So we have our endpoints here. So Spotify is another example. Our query parameters to really hone down that search of whatever resource we're looking at. It could be a pet type here. We have category. And then headers, again, a point of specificity across the HTTP protocol. Request body, that's kind of the most simple one. Response status code. These are all things that will also create assertions against. Things like response status code, we actually have some automated assertions against that that we'll be able to test against. And then the response headers and body. Again, what we looked at before here in our example, we have the ID and then the type, which is cats.
Yeah, and to add on to that, hi everyone, this is Mike Hawley over here. You're going to hear a lot more from me later, but this can look like a lot so far, especially when everything's laid out like this. But really what it boils down to is, what does your REST API expect? And what do you expect out of a response, right? So one of the biggest causes of those error codes is that lack of communication. So it's really important to be able to break down each individual part, know what your API expects, and then build your request based on that, and then be able to test your response based on what you expect to get out of the API.
Yeah, and actually we'll go right next into actual API testing, and not so much how it differs from UI, but really how it's biting into some of the UI market share, and how many times there's more advantage to testing the API layer than there is the UI. So right now, 80% of testing is done manually, and most of it's done at the UI layer. So most of that gray is manually testing done on UI. We operate in like a $4 billion industry. Way more than half of that is expended on human capital, actually going through and working on testing. Gartner and Forrester, they say by 2020 that nearly 80% of all testing will be actually automated now, and then 50% of that testing will be at the API layer. So we just have dramatic growth on the API side and where we're going with testing. And there's a couple of different reasons that we'll go through. But again, it's from a testing perspective, it is the sweet spot, and we're seeing more and more growth out of it. So some advantages real quick of actually testing that service layer. The first one is immediate testing of the business logic. So during a sprint cycle, on day one, you might start your coding on an API. You might take your Swagger spec, generate some client-side code, and then actually maybe make a logic wrapper around it. That is all going to take you maybe half your morning, and you can create a API test shortly thereafter. So immediately on Monday of your sprint cycle, you already had your first test created. Now, if this was on the UI side, that piece of logic would be part of a much larger ensemble that might only be able to be brought together Wednesday of next week. So Wednesday of next week, we have 2 more days left in our 2-week sprint cycle. We're then waiting to get that whole UI and start creating our tests. So the API, we can just immediately start testing and creating assertions against our information. Second, we have it less brittle and easier to maintain. So traditional UI testing the expense is really at the maintenance point. Our UI, our login forms, our buttons, we're changing those a lot, and we're changing them very superficially. It's maybe, again, a color, the size of a button. All these things can break Selenium scripts. They can break other brittle UI tests. On the API side, we're changing much less superficial things and really just changing data and logic that we have a contract for, so we can really upkeep a lot of the changes at the API layer. Next is faster test execution. This is huge. I used to be on the cross-browser testing side, so we were all into running parallel tests on real browsers at speed. And that's because on the UI side, a lot of those tests, those end-to-end tests, can take 3, 5, 10 minutes long to actually fill out the entire form. When you have a lot of regression tests, when you have a lot of tests in your suite, that can take a really long real time to take. So like 30 hours, parts of your week to get through that entire suite. 300 API tests, we could run that maybe in 3 minutes. They're going to be quick 3-second calls. We're going to get our expected response back. And we're not going to have to worry about firing up a browser and worrying about kind of superficial things on the web. And lastly is just faster root cause analysis. We'll see in our next end-to-end example that there's huge advantage to actually being able to see exactly what went wrong in the puzzle that is software. So again, on the UI side, if we get back a number, let's say credit score, and that credit score doesn't match our expected value, well, that's great. We now know something's broken, but we don't know what part of the back end actually broke. There were maybe 10, 15 different services that went into the creation of that one score. And now we have to go track back all the different services and see which one went wrong. If we were doing testing at the API layer, we know exactly which part of that service, exactly which part of that chain actually broke, and we'd be able to go fix it. So a much quicker mean time to resolution. Yeah, I'm actually going to skip here and go to this end-to-end testing flow. This is an example, and this is something we'll see in our SoapUI Pro, that we can, as Ready API client, we can ask, let's say a Maps API for an actual city name based on coordinates. And then with that city name, we can then go ask another API to do something else, or ask something else of the Maps API. But in this example, we're going to ask a weather API the temperature of that city name. So there's a huge end-to-end testing game that is wildly important when we're testing, and we need to test more than just the one series of connections, but kind of keep the larger context in our vision. So here, we have we have 8 different connections, and these are all of them important one by one, but actually having them step by step, which we can do in the SoapUI Pro platform, we'll be able to really isolate what went wrong quickly. And then here's a general look at our platform, what we have today, some of the tooling we'll look at in our demo. We're starting at the bottom. We actually have our API design and documentation. So it sits on the Swagger definition of Swagger Hub. So Swagger Hub allows us to collaborate, standardize, and document on our API design of our open API spec. It's a place where we can share different components of the API, and we can really work on the design portion as a team. Next, we have ServiceUI Pro. So ServiceUI Pro is our virtualization tool in the Ready API platform. That allows us to create a dynamic mock from a definition, from a live API that we can then develop against, test against, and even edit on the fly. You'll see some really cool things we can do with that. Next is functional testing layer. We have SoapUI Pro. So that'll really be the star of our demo today, but that does functional and security testing. And then next stage, we have the performance. So we have LoadUI Pro is our API load testing. LoadUI Pro can take a script made in SoapUI Pro and automatically create that load test. So we can create end-to-end load tests automatically without actually having to do any scripting or create a new test. And then lastly, we have AlertSite. So AlertSite is our API monitoring tool. And again, SoapUI Pro can actually create the scripts that AlertSite can use to functionally monitor either globally or inside your firewall. So as your API is going through a continuous workflow, we can actually have the AlertSite agent on our API on that box telling us the performance in real time as it goes through our staging server, gets load tested, gets functionally tested. And then here's just kind of a quick example of an API being delivered continually with SmartBear. So it starts again on the left with Swagger Hub. We have our Swagger spec. We have our tests created by the Ready API platform sitting in a Git repository, maybe something like GitHub. Once we make a change to that repository, either Bamboo, Jenkins, TeamCity, VSTS, whatever CI server you're using, you'll be automatically listening to that Git repo, and it'll start updating as soon as it sees a change made to it. So we'll run unit tests, static analysis against that code first. Then we'll build and package the actual application. And once there, we'll deploy that service so we can start running our tests. And here, the API is deployed in a container, and we're going to run our API tests against that. We could also run this in a container that's virtualized. So the service itself is virtualized with ServiceUI Pro. We could run it on a VM again or on your local machine with a virtualized asset as well. So once that's done, you might have a larger application that it's feeding, a larger microservice, but we can do end-to-end testing as well in this pipeline. But once we're in production, that's where AlertSite really takes over, and we can run synthetic monitoring against all of your endpoints globally. So we have over 350 nodes that can tell you if your application is responding in real time with a really nice dashboard and some nice logs and instrumentation. So with that, I'm now going to turn it over to Mike. We're going to take a look at testing our REST API with the Ready API platform. You can go ahead and share now. Awesome.
All right. Thanks very much, Dan, for that introduction. Welcome, everyone, to our session today. Once again, my name is Michael Hawley, and we are going to take a look at API testing with Ready API. So the first thing to get started with this is, what are we testing? This could come from a few different places, and we've seen a couple of those examples already in the beginning of our presentation. So this could be a URL with that endpoint and that resource and those query parameters. It could also be an API definition, like a Swagger or a WSDL definition, right? Or Open API, if you will. So all of those are going to tell us information about what our service is going to expect. We make a call out to that service using the configured URLs or the requests created by our service definition. And then we get back that information, right? So this is a simple request response transaction. And it's really important to be able to have that nice, clean, and easy to use look at it, because APIs are the underlying and core functionality of our applications. It's the communication points. So let's get into it then. I'm going to take a look, use Google Maps here to make a call to this service here, right? And we can already see that immediate feedback here. We can take a look at the raw response. And so we could take this manual approach, but that doesn't get us to the finish line any faster. It's not repeatable. So what I can do within SoapUI is create a test immediately, automatically create some validation points, some pass-fail conditions, if you will, to make sure I'm getting back that 200 status code, or have it respond within a certain amount of time. And then immediately run this test case once again, and then get that feedback, right? So things are broken down in a similar view as that raw response here, and we can even continue to take a look at it. But what really sets SoapUI Pro apart from a lot of these manual testing approaches or scripted approaches is that ease of use, that accessibility. So when we think of something a little bit more static within our response, maybe this formatted address node, right? Regardless of any particular value, something that we want to start data driving a little bit later, we want to make sure we're getting back particular parts of our response that are always there, regardless of what kind of input parameters. So as easily as a couple of clicks, the JSON path or XPath expression gets automatically generated for us, and we hit save, and then add this to the list of assertions, and we can see down here that this is good to go, pass our tests here. So what happens if we want to bring in these greater sets of data here, right? We've got this one-off test, and we can change these input parameters, but again, we want to move towards a more scalable or automated process here. So generally speaking, your QAs, your testing folks will be given this giant set of data to run through, and based on these parameters that we've set up, these pass-fail requests, we want to be able to run through those sets quickly, and then be able to run them at scale and put other kinds of tests, security tests, performance tests, things of that nature. So within our data source step here, I'm going to make a call to a database that I've created for this. This is a Postgres database, but we have a number of these options for other like SQL databases here, right, via JDBC. Now, keep in mind, this is all within our UI, so there's no need for these complex SQL queries, setting up, making those connections. Anyone accessibly can make those calls, right, with this SQL query generated automatically, and then we get that table right from our database. All right, so there are a couple more steps to fully get these dots connected here. Instead of these hard-coded values, right, I want to map this to that data source that we're coming in. So with a right click, you can use this get data option, or even easier, this button here on the right, and then map my city. And I also want to validate what I'm getting back from my response based on that expected value within my database or Excel file or what have you. So I'm going to use that same get data to dynamically match what I expect based on that city input here. So again, use that get data and then validate the state. And then last but not least, I'll make one more step. Use this data source loop to tell SoapUI where this data is coming from. And then once we go through that request, keep going for each row within that database. And then we can start running this test. And once we go back to this view here, we can see a couple of these requests being made in real time. And see those results there. So it looks like there's a little bit of a mismatch here. And at this point within SoapUI, we can get full visibility on this, see that those passes and fails here, take a look at the transaction log, see everything stepwise, right? Messages, report on this entire process here in an easily consumable format for our team, as well as automate this entire process either from the command line or one of our many integrations into CI/CD systems, Jenkins, TFS, Bamboo, etc. All right, so this is the first step, making sure that the application runs the way you expect it to, right? And as you continue to create these functional tests and really stress the limits of your APIs, there are a few more kinds of tests that you want to make sure that are passed or at least accounted for before you move to the next stages of production here, right? So the first thing we're going to test is scalability of this API. Once we make sure that our application works as intended, we want to make sure that it works always as intended, no matter how many users are hitting this. So with 3 clicks, we're going to go from SoapUI Pro directly into LoadUI Pro. And for the sake of brevity, I'm going to run this for about 30 seconds. We have this load scenario that we've created here without any additional configuration. So I'm going to run this at 5 simultaneous users for about 30 seconds and then get some feedback on this, these API calls here. Right? Keep in mind that any changes that you make within SoapUI Pro are directly related to that LoadUI Pro test case. So at this point, we can really dig into the statistics here, create these custom graphs and tables. We can monitor our hardware that's driving these API calls here. And if you want to scale up further, we can look into more distributed environments using our load agents or out of the gate EC2 integration as well, right? We also have similar options for reporting as well as automation as well, either from the command line or another one of our using the integrations tab here. So it's really nice to be able to, within this single end-to-end API testing suite, to be able to get that functionality down pat within SoapUI Pro and get that immediately scalable performance or stress test within LoadUI Pro. All right. The one last, or one of the other tools that we'll touch upon here, as far as testing goes, is our security testing suite. So again, we're using that same set of API calls for functional testing, performance testing, as well as security testing here. Out of the box, we've got a number of these common types of OAuth security threats, including cross-site scripts, SQL injections, XPath injections. So I can choose a number of these or all of them, what have you. Again, brings us right into Secure Pro. We can start running these, customizing these, and automating these as well. So it's a really nice and accessible way to take your existing work and be able to reuse these in a bunch of different places. All right. The last tool that we're going to talk about is ServiceUI Pro. All right. And like Dan mentioned before, having that virtualization piece from those initial Swagger definitions, you can start testing against it, faster and more easily. Start making integrations against it, or start, giving access for prototyping for your developers. So with ServiceUI Pro, we get all of that, and we can even take an existing service definition here, right? Like our pet store example, and be able to stand this up in a virtualized and local environment. All right, so I'm going to finish that off and then start modifying this service here. So going from that initial open API definition, we can see all these different resources and methods that are available to us that are defined. And because we have these really deep integrations with Swagger, open source tooling, and the open API definition, we can see a lot of the rework and reusability of that as well, including these example payloads for our requests and responses automatically being detected and brought into the tool here. So there's very little configuration needed as well, right? What makes ServiceUI Pro a little bit different than those traditional mocking or other virtualization tools is the ability to create these context for these responses here. So in addition to be able to customize what we're getting back, we also can create individual rules based on, let's say, our query or resource parameters to return the correct response that we expect. And we can create a full gamut of lifelike responses. We can stand this up within our local environment here. And we even have another tool called VirtServer to be able to deploy these services that we've created into a remote environment for greater DevOps or CI/CD processes as well. All right, and speaking of CI/CD, obviously you want to be able to take these tests that you've created, these virtual services that you've created, and be able to tie them all together as part of a greater pipeline or automated process here. So we have these deep integrations that we're building out with each and every release for all the different ways that your APIs live and work here, right? And this means being able to run these tests within containerized and dynamic environments, being able to use Azure DevOps, Jenkins, TeamCity, these common DevOps and CI/CD tools, or even having the flexibility of running everything from the command line, or share them using the Git protocol as well, be able to scale these test cases management across teams using these repository tools. All right, so that is everything that had planned for today. So just to wrap everything up here, we want to make REST testing as easy for you and your teams as possible. So we can take those individual URLs or those service definitions, be able to bring them into Ready API, be able to functionally test them, create these advanced and robust workflows here, representing those user scenarios, or to iterate quickly through a test set via Excel or databases, be able to do some advanced reporting and automation, and of course reuse these same functional tests, these API calls that you rely on so much for your applications, be able to reuse those for performance tests to really stress your applications in a production-like environment, be able to test the security of your APIs against common types of security threats, and even be able to take those initial service definitions or URLs and be able to virtualize them, be able to create these lifelike instances of these APIs and then deploy them in a way that makes sense for your team for integrations and further testing and prototyping.
Let's get to some questions now.
Awesome.
So, all right, first one, API or data-driven testing. Will the data feed always be sequential for my worksheet if I'm using Excel to provide data for a variable in the request?
Yeah, that's the idea anyway. So you want to be able to set up the request in such a way from that XML set to be able to iterate through those.
Do you have a Excel sheet on you?
Excel, yes,
Let's
I do. Let's
do data generator first.
Sure.
And then I'll actually, do you have your Slack up?
Sorry?
Do you have your Slack up?
Slack? Yeah.
All right, sweet. I'll Slack you. I have City CSV.
Oh,
all right,
perfect.
Let's go through the data generator. I'll send you this right now.
Yeah. Yeah. So, like Dan said, we do have a data generator here, and this will randomly create some test data for a number of different, these different, data types or common types of like cities, addresses, just generally creating some dummy data to be able to feed into your requests here. We also have the ability to, there we go, bring in CSV files, Excel files, things of that nature here. There we go. So in the same way that we had them from my database here, we can also generate a number of these cities here, and then again feed them into our request to run this once again.
It's pretty much the same way. So when you hook up the Excel, it's going to pretty much have two columns. You assign what columns you want as which value, and then you drive through that way. Mm-hmm. New features coming in the next release of Ready API. Sure. So we are building in more automated assertions into SoapUI Pro. Also continuing to expand on our UI UX, cleaning up our response in this window that we're actually looking now, but also deep diving into the API Explorer we've added on the starter page. And then also adding in, again, a little bit more elements of Swagger Hub Inspector right into the Ready interface. That is really on our, should be done in our next release. And we just came out in our last release with pretty much a ton of integrations on the CI/CD side, Docker Hub integration, also support for TCP on the virtualization side as well. So integration with Bamboo, that's the next question. When using SoapUI Pro, what are some of the environment variables and what does that script look like?
Sure. That sounds good. So sorry, just to nail this down, what environment variables?
Yeah, I would say that open up test runner and show what that script looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so we try to make, this CI/CD process as easy as possible, creating those build scripts. So a lot of the arguments come down to what we're running, and this could be the entire project here, specific test suites, test cases, what environment we're running it against, what endpoints, and we can manage those up here with our environments manager and choose those granularly, and what kind of reports, what we're getting out of this test case run, where does it live, and what kinds of reports do we want to generate. So a lot of these common CI/CD tools are going to consume JUnit style reports, but maybe you would also want to create a PDF report as well. And then once everything's configured using our wizard here, we can use this get command line option to build the script to be either executed from the command line or used as a build step for a CI/CD tool. Thanks very much for your question.
Next question actually is also involved with that, and it's actually just about environments and how environment variables, how you can create different assertions based on those parameters, and just quickly, I think, walk through the environment part.
Yeah, for sure. So the idea here is that you want to be able to create your tests once and be able to reuse them again across all of the different environments within your SDLC here, right? So this is QA, staging, our tests and dev environments. And generally speaking, these are all going to have different endpoints, right? So we can create and manage these endpoints. So let's call this a new development endpoint. We can change our REST service to, instead of 8088, it's 9090 or what have you, right? So when we create and modify this environment here, we can apply those sweeping changes across the entirety of our project here using this dropdown. And we can see that the endpoint here is locked to that 9090 port. And this will be true for all the tests within your entire project here. And this also translates to a variable within the command line execution, capital E, I believe. So you can use that data-driven and environment-driven test runs across, and the same test cases across all these different environments very easily within your different steps.
All right, we have another quick question. Are you planning to make enhancements to the SoapUI Pro testing integration for TFS, VSTS, Azure DevOps? Answer to your question is definitely yes. So we did this as well with Jenkins, put out our first release. And then coming over the next subsequent releases, we'll be adding in all the functionality of the entire command line runner. So we'll definitely kind of be beefing up that integration on the VSTS side. We did the same thing with Jenkins, where last release, we came out with those additional report types and the multiple SoapUI projects that are referenced. And speaking of reporting, can we show reporting real quick?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll use this last test run that I did. There we go. So I mentioned this a little bit before, but we can create a lot of different kinds of test result data. So this raw XML or CSV data, JUnit style report, or very simply a PDF report. And I feel like in a lot of ways, this PDF really shows off sort of the accessibility and legibility. So we've got at a high level what tests that we've ran. And as we move to the different pages here, it gets more and more granular, right? So we can see, let's try this again. There we go. So this is the test that we've ran, configuration of our steps, some runtime metrics, and again, those stepwise pass fails like we saw within our transaction log a little bit earlier. And then for each of our failed steps within this test, we're able to see the full stack trace here. So what failed, why it failed based on our messages, as well as the full request response transaction here as well. Really good for our developers to make those changes in the back end, really get that granular detail so they can make those corrections, and you can have this running successfully the next time around.
All right, next question. There's a couple open source questions. So first off, you can import all of your open source projects right in the Ready API. You're going to bring over all of your assertions and everything like that. Mm-hmm. So it really seamlessly hooks up cleanly. Then we're going to add, again, a lot of the pro features, like like load testing and service virtualization, security testing that are next level on top of what the open source offers. And then lastly, the data. We saw data today. We saw creating cities, driving them through, not only creating the data, but the ability to hook up the data is the large advantage over the open source tool set. All right. I think that's going to wrap up today for us. So this is REST testing with SoapUI Pro. Thank you, everyone, for attending today, and enjoy the rest of your day.